All right, welcome. Today, we are diving into one of the most intense, high-stakes moments in the entire book of Exodus. See, after let's call it a major breach of contract, we get to witness this powerful renegotiation. This is a second chance, literally carved in stone. It's the story of a divine deal. So, that really gets us to the big question that hangs over this whole chapter. What does a divine second chance even look like? I mean, it's not just a quick apology and a handshake. No. As we're about to see, this involves a formal, incredibly serious, binding agreement with some unbelievably high stakes. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we're going to get a handle on what this covenant renewal really is. Then, we'll get into the nitty-gritty, the promises and the warnings. After that, we'll look at the sacred appointments they had to keep, uncover a truly mind-blowing guarantee, and finally, we'll zoom in on the fine print that made this relationship so unique. Okay, let's get right into it. Now, you have to understand the backstory here. It is absolutely crucial. The first agreement, it was completely shattered. You know, the whole golden calf incident. So this isn't just God handing down a new set of rules. This is all about rebuilding a broken relationship and resetting the terms. And the key word here is covenant. Now, don't think of this like some casual promise. It's much more like a legally binding, totally sacred contract. It's got clauses, it's got obligations for both sides, and it's got consequences. Just like any serious deal today, but, the stakes are divine. So what's actually in this new contract? Well, like any good deal, it has two very clear sides. It lays out exactly what each party is bringing to the table. No ambiguity here. And here it is. The quid pro quo, laid out plain and simple. On God's side of the ledger, the promise is huge. Perform wonders no one has ever seen. Clear the land of all its current inhabitants, and actually expand their borders. And in return, Israel's obligation is total, 100% uncompromising loyalty. That means no treaties with the locals, tearing down their altars, and an absolute ban on worshiping any other god. This wasn't just about good behavior, you see. It was about forging a completely separate and distinct identity, totally different from all the cultures around them. And, the text does not mince words on that last point. I mean, this quote right here is incredibly intense. It uses this deeply personal, almost emotional language, giving God the name jealous, to just hammer home the point that this demand for exclusive loyalty, it's the absolute, non-negotiable heart of the entire agreement. So, the terms are set. But how was this loyalty supposed to work in the real world, day to day? Well, it wasn't just some abstract idea. It was actually built right into the very rhythm of their national life. And the answer really hinges on this number 3. 3 times every single year, the entire nation had to literally stop what they were doing and physically show their commitment by going on these mandatory journeys, these pilgrimages. Now, these weren't just holidays like we think of them today. No way. They were massive, reoccurring national acts of allegiance. Think of them as real-time nation-building exercises. By having all the men show up before God 3 times a year to remember the Exodus, they weren't just reaffirming the deal, they were forging a shared history and a collective identity together. Okay, and this is where the agreement goes from being just demanding to something truly extraordinary. Because tucked inside this command for these big national trips is one of the most stunning, almost unbelievable promises in the whole text. Just think about the logistics of this for a second. Seriously, if every single able-bodied man in the nation packs up and leaves his home, his farm, his family, and his borders completely unguarded to go to a festival, what happens? I mean, that's a strategic nightmare. It's basically a wide-open invitation for any enemy to just walk right in and take everything. And here's the solution that's baked right into the divine deal. The text promises that no one will even want their land while they're away. Now, according to commentators like the famous Rashi, this isn't just some nice prediction. This is a miraculous guarantee, a promise of supernatural protection for their totally exposed borders. So you see, this whole commandment, it's not just about showing up for a party. It's a test. It demands this incredible nationwide leap of faith. It's a literal act of radical trust, backed up by an equally radical divine promise. All right, finally, let's look at the fine print. Because just like any contract, this covenant has a few very specific, maybe even a little peculiar rules. And these aren't just random, oh no. They are specifically designed to create a distinct identity for the people, setting them apart in their everyday lives. These are the things that made the covenant real and tangible. Dedicating the firstborn was a way to recognize God as the source of all life. Bringing the first fruits of the harvest was an acknowledgement of their total dependence for food. And these unique dietary laws, like not cooking a young goat in its mother's milk, they created social boundaries. Every single rule served as a constant, physical reminder of who they were and the special deal they had made. So at the end of the day, we're left with this incredibly complex document. It's part grand promise of a national destiny, part strict legal contract, and part instruction manual for daily life. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does this ancient blend of spectacular promises and hyper-specific rules tell us about how relationships are built, whether between people or between a people and their God, on a deep foundation of faith, trust, and mutual obligation? Thanks for joining me on The Explainer.